Hi guys, it's Kian. Today I'm going to tell you a story. It has some truth, but also some falsehoods sprinkled in. But just listen to it as a story, don't take it as fact. And yeah, so the world is your oyster. It's a phrase that many of us probably have heard, and I've heard for a long time. And I think the context to me is what is an oyster. And if you live where I do in the age where I did when I grew up, um, there are primarily two types of oysters that were familiar to me. One is the one in hawker centers, that is oyster omelette. We're just gonna have to deal with the noise. Um, so oyster omelette, generally speaking, sold like, I don't know what's the price now. Used to be like $5 or $6, which is considered relatively expensive for hawker food. Like hawker food at that time was about maybe $3-4. But also, like, despite the price, you kind of are a bit wary often about the freshness of the oysters. So I never really tried it until I was much older. Then the second type of oysters that I knew were the more posh kind, that is basically raw oysters served with lemon, and those are in like Western restaurants where they also serve wine. That's the kind of context that I grew up in. And so the phrase "the world is your oyster" has always sounded a bit strange to me. It sounded a bit strange, I think, because like I always feel like the phrase "the world is your oyster" is meant to be telling you that there's a lot more out there, a lot more that you can explore, a lot more that you can take and enjoy. But given the context of what I knew at that time to be oysters, which were one, the slightly more inexpensive option, but everybody, or rather my parents, were always very scared that it would be like not safe enough to eat, like the hawker center one. And then the other option is the expensive one, which were like, to me, like not too posh for whatever I was gonna do. It always felt kind of limiting. And then much later, I came to know about oysters in Korea. And the thing with oysters in Korea is that they are they are actually quite abundant. I was gonna say quite plentiful, but I think it's more than that. They are very abundant, especially during the seasons that they are in season. I don't know what's the season they're in season, but when they are in season, they are very abundant. And they don't just cook like one or two meals with it. They do things like oyster kimchi. They do like, instead of like seafood pancakes, it's mostly oyster, so it's like oyster pancakes. They also do like just like regular oysters, buttered and fried. Maybe not buttered, breaded and fried, I think. There's also a whole bunch of other like stew dishes and all that. They even cook it in rice. I think it was the Culinary Class Wars season 1. There was this lady that got eliminated in the first round. This older woman who got eliminated in the first round because her dishes are too salty without rice. I don't remember her nickname, but that lady, she cooked a lot of oyster dishes, and that got me thinking about oysters. I don't know how this video is gonna turn out, because like I think the audio is gonna be very crap. But anyway, we're keeping on. So oysters, there's so when I learned about oysters in Korea and how abundant they were, and I think to me that was a shift in thinking in terms of like think it shows up in the way that the food is made, like the way the oysters are used in food. It's not just like this is the only thing that you make oysters in. This is not the only recipe for oysters. You don't just eat it raw, or you don't just make it in oyster omelets. But it's like it's so plentiful. There's so much of it to eat that we are putting it in everything. We're putting it in our rice. We're putting it in our kimchi. We're putting it in our stews, in our fried food, our seafood pancake. We're putting it in everything because there's so much of it. There's no need to be like stingy about it. There's no need to be like I only must eat it raw because that's when it's the tastiest, or like I cannot coat it in sauce because then that kind of defeats the purpose of eating oysters. Why don't you just eat some other cheaper food? Like, no, it's cheap there, right? And I don't know if I'm expressing it very well, because honestly speaking, I'm really struggling with the noise. But like, don't you think it's a very beautiful scenery? But back to oysters, I think I never really understood abundance in the phrase "the world is your oysters," and the world is an oyster until I learned about the abundance of Korean oysters when they're in season, and how it shows up in the various ways they're cooked. And that made me think, like, is it something that is not possible from a place of scarcity? Like, if oysters are expensive and rare like they were for me growing up in Singapore, is it possible to think of oysters in a way that will result in you making dishes like what the Koreans would make with them? And I think, generally speaking, the answer is probably no. I think it's the circumstances that make it possible for you to even contemplate the way you just kind of like treat oysters like they're so common, you just do whatever you want with it, and that results in like a whole variety of oyster dishes. And the way I look at this realization, I was telling it to my sister one day when we were eating oyster omelette and drinking soju at home, that like these two different point of views of oyster, one being kind of it's scarce, you gotta eat it raw, it's expensive, you gotta eat it raw with lemon. And then the Korean way of cooking oysters, which is that, you know, it's very plentiful, we put it in everything because we just gotta eat it when it's in season. Like, you can't go from the one where you are just like oysters are rare and therefore must be treated as if they are precious. We must treat them like we only eat it when it's raw, which means that it's fresh, and then we only add a little bit of like seasoning, like lemon, so that we can taste it. Versus the kind of attitude you have where you're like, we're gonna fry it, we're gonna draw it in sauce, we're gonna do whatever with it, right? You're not gonna get to that from a place where you see it as rare. You're not gonna come into abundance when you're standing in a place or in an environment of scarcity, I think. And I think that is when I realized the world is an oyster is a phrase that is actually really about abundance, as it should be, but I didn't really understand it given the earlier context that I had. And this is when I kind of paused the story. I know the story is kind of boring. I wish I made it more entertaining, but you know, I'm talking off the top of my head, trying to shout over the cars. But anyway, this is where I pause the story to tell you some facts, which if you watched the earlier video, anyway. So some facts. Oysters used to be poor people's food in the sense of like they were plentiful, they were relatively cheap. People use it as a cheap source of protein in various countries. You can go and search it up. And I think that is probably when the phrase "the world is an oyster" came from. But the more modern world, which is the one that I grew up in, and probably the one that is in most people's memories, is one where oysters are generally treated as expensive. Except maybe if you're in Korea where it's still quite abundant. And so I guess the point of the story was really about scarcity and abundance, and how being granted a different point of view from abundance allows you to then be able to see, hey, the earlier point of view that I had was really one of scarcity. But if you're just struggling in scarcity without being exposed to any idea of the abundant mindset, I don't know whether it's possible to embody that abundance purely from the scarcity mindset. But as a story, right, there are flaws in it because it is, well, it's not like I outright told you a lie. I told you something that was true relative to me. But it's not entirely true in the sense of like what I told you, right? There's facts that oysters used to be cheap and abundant. So if you look at a story in terms of is it factually true, it's not factually untrue, but it's not entirely factually true because I left out the bit of telling you that oysters used to be abundant. That's where the phrase "the world is an oyster" probably came from. But hearing it personified in a way that there is some personal truth, and in which there are also points of views that assume certain things that are kind of false. I don't know, does it make it easier to understand? Is it better with the facts? I don't really know whether it's better with the facts. I want to search up the facts only because I was thinking I want to make this video and I don't really want to misinform people. But then like I could have easily just like not done the facts bit and just told you the story about my point of view with oysters, and just let, like, if you guys know the facts you can throw it in the comments and then I'll learn something, right? And like, there's nothing wrong with doing that. I guess I'm just not comfortable with it yet, and that's why I still ended up checking the facts. Yeah, I don't know whether this was a video that was I don't know, coherent. I'm just gonna end it here. I think I've said more than I need to actually, and you're probably tired of the audio. Alright, bye.